I was 10, 11, 12, I don't remember, in line for the movies. And there were two guys in line in front of us, like 3 or 4 people in front of us holding hands. And my mother pulled me to her, not my siblings, just me, and looked at my father and said, "They're weird," which just made me look at those guys. And I went, oh, now I get it. I'm weird like they're weird. And I looked at them and I thought, they look happy. They look like they're in love. I'll be fine.
Inform brings you incredible stories.
I left 2 days before the revolution. It killed me so hard.
James has never experienced the taste of fruits that haven't been attacked by pesticides, just like he's never experienced a neighborhood that hasn't been attacked by bullets. Some things just go hand in hand.
People say what's on their mind.
I think that it is a cardinal sin to lie to the American people about war.
Partisanship is a version of narcissism.
In downtown San Francisco, the Commonwealth Clubs and Forum curates events that bring you face to face with the world's changemakers.
1/3 of the wage gains that women have made since the 1960s were made as a result of the birth control pill.
Twitter is a technology that I don't think we've seen before in this world.
Since 1903, the most innovative leaders have come to the Commonwealth Club to share their vision.
Sharing cars, sharing their homes, sharing. A shared dream, a shareable American dream. That could work.
You each can play a role in helping us chart a better future.
Housing and health and education and policy all live close to the surface in us when our children are murdered. It's all the same story.
We bring together the visionaries shaping the emerging trends in technology.
It was a combination of instant and telegram. It was the idea that you could take a moment in time and you could capture it and you could just send it out and broadcast it with the entire world.
I just threw this site together in about a week when I was at school.
Oh, great.
We've got angels, we've got incubators, we've got accelerators, we've got seed funds, we've got crowdfunding.
We eat, we drink.
One of our first dates ever, we pickled like 100 pounds of herring and made 300 pounds of sauerkraut.
Yay!
We never shy away.
75% of the people of this country want universal health care and expect it. And damn it, let's go.
Concentrated, deep, slow, loving, tender, passionate sex.
Whether you want to be on the cusp of current events or feast on pop culture.
I should have a great time writing. I should write a book that is as fun as any party I'd be skipping.
Inform events are fun and action-packed.
I have an anthropology scarf that does that twisty thing, so.
Come feed your mind and soul and celebrate the future with Inform.
I love San Francisco, and every time I come back here, I remember that this is the only city in America that has magic.
Hello and welcome to today's virtual program with Inform at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Marisa Lagos, correspondent for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk. Today, I'm pleased to be in conversation with Jennifer Steinhauer. She is a Washington, D.C. correspondent for the New York Times, and today we get to talk about her new book, The First, the inside story of the women reshaping Congress, which is now available for purchase at a local bookstore. In it, she tracks the rise of the newly elected women of the 2018 House of Representatives as they pursue groundbreaking change and close out their first term on the Hill. If you'd like to ask her a question today, please ask it in the chat if you're watching on YouTube or in the comments on Facebook, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the program. For now, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you. I always love being at the Commonwealth Club, even virtually.
I know. We were supposed to do this in person, but something big happened, the pandemic.
More than one thing, yes. It was great to be here.
Well, I kind of want to start with the other big thing because obviously this book is about this, I guess, not statistically massive in the sense that there's still, a quarter of Congress, but we did see this surge of women elected in 2018. Most of almost nearly all of them Democrats. And it strikes me that they are actually playing a really key role in this moment as we see the Black Lives Matter protests really roil America. You know, Ayanna Pressley from Boston, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, Rashida Tlaib, many more. They're all women of color. So to start, because this is the story of the day, can you talk about what you've sort of witnessed in terms of how they're talking about these protests, the role they're playing right now as leaders in these demonstrations?
Well, if you think about their campaigns, and I thank you for your question, going back into 2018, I'm not going to say that they presaged this particular moment, but they spoke about all that had led to it. And if you think about Ayanna Pressley, who you mentioned from Boston, she wasn't running because she was more liberal against the long-term Democratic incumbent that she unseated. She was running because, as she put it, change can't wait. She was looking for new representation that looked more like certain aspects of that district that had changed over the years and were more immigrant and less white. I can remember very much talking to her for the book about letter writing campaign that was done for men in prison to try and get people on the outside to go out and vote for her. So we're talking about a really different set of voters. And these issues these women talked about during the campaign about equity, about healthcare equity. We have always seen the COVID crisis, great racial inequalities with who's gotten the most sick and who's died. They're talking about policing issues and the kind of things. And those, in a sense, sort of went to the wayside when they began legislating in 2019. And there were other topics that they were engaged in at that time. And so, in a sense, they were ahead of the game on where we are now in this moment. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in particular, not just because she is really, in my view, the titular head of the progressive end of the party now that Bernie is exiting the stage, but obviously she's in a district in New York City that was the true epicenter of the COVID crisis in the center of New York City, and obviously a place where there's a lot of the protests now and the interactions with the police. And so she's been speaking out and participating in that, obviously, as well.
Do you see yet, and I want to get, into a lot of the stuff in the book, but are they putting forth legislation or policy that you think is aimed at really tackling some of the underlying issues? Because I do think that's sort of the $10 gazillion question right now is what's next? And I'm curious if there's things in writing yet or being talked about with this class in particular, freshman lawmakers, in terms of how to tackle some of the huge inequities we're seeing both play out, through the protests more broadly, but also obviously through the COVID crisis.
So lots of interesting things. Of course, Congress hasn't really been here, especially in the House, and they've had to vote remotely on certain things or vote by proxy. And they've mostly been focused, on relief efforts for cities and individuals and unemployment and so forth due to the COVID crisis. But you are starting to hear people talk about legislation. I was really interested to see yesterday, and I saw it in his Twitter feed, Justin Amash, the independent from Michigan, former Republican, obviously, who toyed with running against Trump, joined with Ayanna Pressley on a police accountability bill. So I think you're going to see these interesting left-right alliances that you sometimes see around issues of national security and policing and constitutional rights and so forth. And I think that the Republicans too are seeing the pressure. If you look around the country, we know, yes, we see what's going on in New York City and DC, but there are protests, as you know, peaceful protests in every city, small town in this country, including in red states. So I think you have to have in divided government partners on the other side to really actually get things done. So I think you'll see some of that, but I definitely think that you're going to see in the House itself, even if these are bills that aren't taken up by the Senate, you're going to see them start definitely where these women will have an imprint from their committees on oversight, on policing and other matters.
I want to go back in time in just a moment, but before we do, something you wrote kind of strikes me in this context, which is that the increase in women in Congress in 2019 was symbolically important, but that through your reporting, you came to believe that their diversity in age, race, religion, economic standing could actually be more transformative than their gender alone. It seems to me like this is the moment where we're seeing that. Is that fair?
I think so. First of all, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, we're not even quite 25%. And party trumps gender for sure in Congress in this divided time, much more than it did, for example, in the 70s, believe it or not. If anyone's watching Mrs. America, you really see how Republican and Democrat women came together to support the ERA and a lot of other things we forget about. That's not true now. Definitely people stick with their parties more. Having said that, women do tend to coalesce around certain types of things. When you have a super majority, much bigger majority, like in the Nevada legislature, which is a slight majority of women. But where I saw impact more, whether it was around legislation or the kinds of issues that people were talking about in committees. I go back to Ayanna Pressley on oversight, talking about childhood trauma, which obviously is going to be incredibly relevant in this moment, both from kids being out of school, with COVID and what's going on in the streets and Black Lives Matter and so forth. That's just not the kind of thing that you would have had in a Congress, even 2 years before, a Black maternal health caucus, those kind of things. It was obviously extremely controversial and painful for this class to have what happened around the issues of Israel and what some viewed as anti-Semitism with Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. But what I submit is that those conversations wouldn't have happened at all because there was no space in Congress to question the foreign policy relationship between the U.S. and Israel with Democrats or Republicans, which also opened up another space for Black Democrats to say, how come we're not talking about police brutality? We're worried about anti-Semitism, and you've never been worried about those issues. So these are people who've been in Congress for many years. So a lot of these conversations were fermented not because they were women, but because you saw people from so many different groups that had been underrepresented, or in the case of Native American women before 2019, not represented at all.
And they also came from just such different backgrounds, right, than a lot of the people, men or women, who have been in Congress. But I want to get to that. But I actually want to go back because I think you really set the stage in this book about the history of women in Congress, starting with Jeannette Rankin, right? 1917, a suffragist. How did she manage to get elected before women even had the vote? Talk about that and how she was received.
Yeah, it was very interesting. She really, she was running as a suffragist, and that was one of her issues, and later became much about being a pacifist. She's the only person who voted against World War I and World War II. And the second vote, I can promise you, was not popular. She was the only person to do that, and she was chased out to a telephone booth in the cloakroom after that vote. So she was really quite something. But she did what a lot of women do, which is when they are running on, even as a woman, running on that particular issue, she really broadened it out to workers' rights issues and talking about children and things like that in ways that people in her community could relate to, rural issues, which mattered to them from her state in Montana. So she was able to be very appealing. And what's interesting about women from that time is a lot of them who were elected, first of all, not Jeannette Rankin, but many took, their dead husbands' seats. And so they were seen more as a curiosity than a threat. That changed a lot in the 70s.
Yeah, I want to get to that. I think you talk about the sort of parallels between that, where you had agitators and incrementalists coming in around that time. And I've been really interested in recent years about the sort of rise of Shirley Chisholm on the left as this, icon, which I think for some people she was, but in some ways she kind of left office not that well known. Tell us about her and kind of why you think, it's almost like her story has been revived in some ways in recent years. Yeah, it really has. And I was really interested to see a lot of the new women were super interested in Shirley Chisholm. And you point out, it's absolutely right. She's obviously it's this big piece in Mrs. America. There's been parks now in New York, statues and things are erected to recognize fighting Shirley Chisholm. I think, first of all, with regards to that specifically, people running for office now finding her history important because she sort of was intersectional before that was a word. She talked a lot about the fact, she always said frequently that she thought being a woman was more difficult for her than being a Black American in Washington and in her political career. And in fact, when she won her Democratic primary in Brooklyn, the man she was running against made an outright case that a woman shouldn't hold that seat. Women shouldn't be in politics. But she
represented so many ways that people can succeed, which is to being an agitator and being a street fighter and really kind of, being for the people, and that being her and empowering Black women and giving a lot of speeches about that. But at the same time, one of the things that hurt her with her party a lot is she did work across the aisle. She went to visit George Wallace in the hospital after he was shot. He said she was his most formidable competitor for the White House. So she had a very complicated alliances and ways of working. I think she left kind of, as many people do, a little bit defeated by Washington and was sort of forgotten for many years. But now of that group of women, Bella Abzug and so forth, from that era, Pat Schroeder, I do think that she's the person that young people have the most awareness of and that they see parallels with current lawmakers.
And that was a time, right, when, like you said, like the sort of first class which were largely widows or had sort of wealthier patrons. They were white, they were middle class, educated. They didn't necessarily have the same pushback that you saw in the 60s and 70s. Things like the Equal Rights Amendment. Can you talk about like why that was? I mean, it seems like it's partly who these people were, but also what they came to Washington to accomplish compared to the earlier women who were maybe didn't have that grand plan when they ended up there.
Yeah, even though some of them did, certainly Lily Boggs made, significant changes in that more incremental way. I mean, it was interesting. I would have thought they would have faced a lot more abject sexism. And when I dug into that, what I realized is by inheriting their husband's seats, and some of them even said, would go by, Mrs. John Smith. I mean, they were not necessarily feminists at all. They were seen as extensions of their husbands and very non-threatening. They knew them from the campaigns. Perhaps they'd worked in their district office. And then they were just there to kind of carry out his agenda until, a man could finally fill that seat, although often they would run on their own accord and win. But when women started to really run on their own, at the time that women were entering the workplace in larger numbers, during the feminist movement, that became much more threatening to men. Women were consciously making their own choice intentionally to join and to participate fully, and that wanted power on committees and so forth. And that was something that a lot of men could not brook. And of course, you mentioned the Me Too movement. I mean, talk about a place where just gross sexism reigned. That was certainly the cloakrooms of both parties. We know that, until very recently, the pool in the gym that the senators used couldn't even be used by women. And when they went to figure out why, it was because male senators were swimming naked. And that was, a rule until in the last decade that got changed. So that was a cross for those women to bear, but they just started running in so many numbers, and they started to have enough where they could have a women's caucus and start to really work together outside of the committee system to really try to affect change. I personally, I don't want to be a spoiler. We all know what happened with the Equal Rights Amendment, but the very last episode of Mrs. America, I think the text says, women have never, as a political movement, ever had as much power again as they had in the 70s. And I had to stop and really think about that and think, wow, that's probably actually true. And these women in Congress were a huge piece of that.
Wow. Well, you mentioned something else that I've certainly talked to Congresswomen about in the past, but the sort of physical manifestation of the sexism of DC in the building itself. Like you mentioned the gym. I mean, I think women had like some tiny like basement space until, like you said, recently. I know Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has spoken a lot about her kind of fight to bring her kids onto the even into the cloakrooms outside of the Senate. The dress code is still an issue. Talk about like how male senators have sort of used these physical things to continue. I don't know. It seems like a very patriarchal system in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived a lot of places. Washington definitely remains the most stodgy and formal, even though things are changing here outside of the federal government and official Washington. It's still a place that, until a few years ago, women were, including members of Congress, were not allowed to be sleeveless on the floor of the House. Now, it's pretty cold in there, But as you know, when you're moving in and out of office buildings all day on the giant campus, you've maybe been in August in Washington, D.C., that was pretty oppressive to a lot of people. And men still have to wear ties and dress a certain way in and around the area of the House floor. Women didn't even have a bathroom outside the House floor until 2011. That was actually John Boehner who kind of broke through some walls of the Appropriations Committee to give them one. They had to walk down the hall. The Senate, same. Women had a bathroom near the floor, but it had only 2 stalls, which was a little bit okay because they used to cut deals in line while they were waiting for the bathroom. So they kind of had their space there, their women's club, if you will. But that's finally expanded too. Women, and it was only until Senator Sinema from Arizona was sworn in, and she only wore sleeveless dresses, and they kind of quietly allowed female senators to. Most have not chosen to do that, but she's quietly been permitted to do that, even though staff members are still not. So it's when I walk around, look, the history of our country is a story that is told when you walk around and look at the artwork and the statues and the paintings of important members of Congress and Americans in those halls. It's not predominantly female. It's not even quite a lot of it female, and you that's just very palpable in that space.
Yeah, not just men, white men, right? I mean, but this isn't. And then I want to move on to 2018, but. What's interesting here, like you just mentioned Boehner, it's not like it's been a partisan thing, which I think maybe people outside of Washington might assume. I think you say Ted Kennedy might have been one of the senators who liked to swim nude, and like it's there's been actually some progress. I think maybe more progress in recent years under some of the male speakers and Republicans. So I mean, do you feel, has it taken on more of a partisan tone at all lately, or is it very much sort of in the, I don't know, Congress is almost like its own reality in a lot of ways, right?
It is. It's complicated because it's gotten much, much harder for Republican women to get elected. For years and years and years, there were just a few number of women in Congress, and sometimes it was a Republican, sometimes it was a Democrat, and one of both. And it wasn't, until the 70s when you started to really see that divide, and you still had a lot of Republican women winning. In the last 10 years, it's been just this precipitous drop, and not just in Congress, by the way, writ large. As the party's gotten more and more conservative, it's gotten more and more difficult for women in the Republican Party to win primaries. If they can't get through primaries, obviously they're not winning general elections. And I talked to, there's a Republican chapter in my book actually that talks about this. And I talked to a woman who ran in North Carolina in a special election and lost her primary this year, a very conservative Republican pro-life pediatrician, which is basically kind of unheard of. And she said she wished she had more male validators out with her because she thought that was going to help her with women and men over a certain age. A lot of the stuff we see, by the way, I want to point out, we think about party and we think about race and class. Those are obviously always factors. But generation, we should never dismiss that. A lot of things we're seeing happening now, different views on things. We see the kids kind of leading these protests and so forth. A lot of this stuff is generational. That we write off to other things. So, so in terms of having electoral power, I think Republican women have lost a lot of ground. Once they're in halls of Congress, which you're asking me about, I think they're pretty. They hold equal power, generally speaking, within their parties. Liz Cheney is. You see the minority leader. You see Kevin McCarthy from California in that role. Liz Cheney's running that stuff. And if they ever come back to have power, I have no doubt she would be their speaker. So once they're there, I think it's kind of equal. And in terms of offenders and sexual harassment, that's been pretty even too with the parties, as we know. We see that in the private sector too. So.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about 2018, and I want to start with AOC because that was kind of the kickoff of that cycle because it was in the primary that she beat Joe Crowley. Sitting here in San Francisco, it is surprising, almost shocking to me to this day that not just Joe Crowley, but that Nancy Pelosi didn't see that coming. I mean, she is so good usually at having her finger on the pulse of things. So can you talk about how AOC approached that campaign and why you think she was successful in unseating somebody who was so powerful within her own party?
Yeah, I would. There's a lot of mythology around that race too. I also think I just love to mention that the night that she won, I learned about it on my phone in the green room at the Commonwealth Club, because we were doing an election panel there with a bunch of my colleagues, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Martin and others. And we looked at our phone and said, whoa, what we were taking, what just happened? What happened?
Yeah.
And boy, we went out there and everybody in San Francisco knew about a House race in Brooklyn, because in Queens, because that's San Francisco, right? People knew her name. She first of all, Joe Crowley, a couple things. Everyone says it took everyone by surprise except for her. It's kind of the other way around. I spoke to her team extensively for the book, and they all said they had no idea what was going to happen that night until it happened. It's not great polling for a House race like that. Conversely, I think that former Congressman Crowley did see some flares coming, and he didn't want to inform Nancy Pelosi. She can't keep her hand in the busy midterm election in every little race. That's not a race she would have even thought anything about. Some, unheard of challenger to this big time incumbent. He didn't want to set up those red flares because he didn't want to, assuming he could win, he didn't want to appear vulnerable. And he didn't want to go back to his colleagues, victorious, and have them know how much he actually had to sweat it. And as you may remember, he didn't even show up to their first debate. He sent a surrogate. Bad look. So, and she did the shoe leather thing, and she went this is what all these women did, door to door, just trying to get every single vote, running aggressively against Trump, which he really wasn't. He was running, on sort of some basic hard, bread and butter Democratic issues. Again, reaching out to different kinds of voters. But here's the thing that everyone needs to understand about AOC. She won that race principally with the vote of a lot of white people in Queens, who had fled Manhattan, and started moving out into other boroughs. Very progressive, again, younger, right? Generationally interested in a candidate like that. Joe Crowley actually held his own and won most of those minority neighborhoods where he had been long known. So she was really appealing, again, to a more progressive wing of the party that wants to push the party, the Bernie way, and not the Joe Crowley, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden way. And so that was the dynamic of that race. And I really do authentically believe she was as surprised as everybody else that night.
What does that tell you that was her base, at least in this Democratic primary? Right. Because I think that the conversation that's been roiling the Democratic Party throughout its primary was like sort of the either or. Do we go after those white, non-educated non-college educated voters that Trump, won, or do we try to turn out a bigger multiracial, younger coalition? I think a lot of people I've talked to, and I'm sure you have, think it shouldn't be an either or, it should be an and. But is that a sign of, I don't know, weakness for AOC? Has she brought along that part of her constituency? How do you see that right now?
I mean, I always kind of felt that when they arrived in Washington, there was an immediate conflict that speaks to what you were just talking about in terms of legislating, because you had some progressive folks, mostly women, who won safe Democratic seats and were very much the voice of, and an aggressive voice for moving the party to the left, right? And the Republicans had gone through this for the past 10 years, and now it was the Democrats' turn. And there were a lot of policy issues. And I always like to point out too, people have to have perspective on that, because, for example, in the space of healthcare, the idea of single payer, which has now become considered the moderate position for Democrats, was considered left-wing lunacy that people lost their seats over in the time that I've been in Washington. So people kind of forget, how much the party has moved to the left naturally among all of them, right? Mm-hmm. In ways that the people on the farther left, they're moving the needle so much farther. People kind of lose that perspective and they forget that. Having said that, there were a lot of so-called moderate Democrats who won seats from Republicans. And their point of view was, hey, we're the reason that the Democrats took back the House because we won Republican seats, and we have to vote consistent with our district. We don't want to lose, and we don't have enough of those. Great, we love all these progressive voters that you want to attract. We don't have enough of them. We don't even have enough Democrats. We have to speak to persuadable independents, and in some cases, obviously Republican, particularly suburban Republican women who'd been disenchanted. So that was the conflict over bills and votes, and people were upset with AOC in the beginning because you may remember she threatened primary challenges against people even in her own delegation. That didn't go over very well. I noticed she didn't do that too much in 2020, which I thought was interesting because that was a choice she had to make. And she went a different way with that. But I always felt, and then we saw in the race for the White House, we saw where we ended up in the beginning with Bernie having all that momentum. And then when you started to get out of those more places where younger progressive voters were dominating, and you saw the base of the Democratic Party, it went very quickly the other way. And we saw where the heart, to make the Joe Crowley analogy, you see where the heart and soul of those base Democratic voters in the majority for now really lies. But we are now watching right in front of us as we speak in real time. What I always thought would be the future of the party is probably going to be more in more some mold of where AOC is pushing it, right? As younger voters, first of all, they have to actually go and vote. That's been a problem, obviously. And as more of them kind of hew to those policy beliefs, but it's a process, it's a trajectory, and she probably is sitting somewhere in the middle of it right now.
Yeah, I mean, she arrived in Washington, as the whole class did, with high hopes and a lot of ideas in their heads, and I think you kind of detailed some of, before they even got sworn in, the flap over potentially challenging Congressman Jeffries and others. But then there was other things too, right? The rollout of the Green New Deal didn't go as planned. A lot of the legislation, some of it didn't even make it out of the House or got sort of marred by Republican amendments. Like, how effective do you think she's been in DC versus her role as the sort of head of the progressive movement? Is it is her power in some ways more focused in the power of the bully pulpit than it is in actually legislating, do you think?
Yeah, no, I thank you for that question, because I think it's something that confuses people a lot. They see AOC on TV, they go on her Instagram with her gajillion followers, and they watch her put together IKEA furniture, and they know that they're not doing that for any other member of Congress, and they never have before, or perhaps even been interested in members of Congress. And so they feel like this is the most powerful person in Washington. Well, power in Washington is accrued very differently. It's this place that very much values seniority. Half the people in this town are in the positions they're in just by dint of hanging around long enough. Seniority is everything in an institution like Congress. You also have to build coalitions. Sometimes it's bipartisan coalitions when you want to do really big things, but even when you want to, have bills pass the House that may not be considered by the Senate in divided government or by a Republican president, getting them through the House is an accomplishment. It does set the benchmark for your party, but you need a coalition within your party. And you can't do that by alienating people and telling them that you're going to primary them and all their friends. Right. It's like any other workplace, these are personal relationships, and so a lot of it is. So I think she learned from that. New Green Deal, good example, came in before they were even sworn in, joined young protesters outside Nancy Pelosi's office to have a special climate committee. So they said, okay, and they formed the committee, and then she refused to be part of it because she didn't think it was going to have any teeth, which was true. They didn't do anything, but that was a real insult to Nancy Pelosi. She was the Speaker of the House, and she asked you to be on this thing where she thought you would lend an important voice. Was not particularly consultative on the Green New Deal, which was something that a lot of her colleagues were not ready for. Again, the cap and trade bill, 10 years prior cost a lot of Democrats their seats. They were very skittish about it. At the same time, that Green New Deal thing, which went nowhere in Congress, had a huge political impact because everybody running for president had to weigh in on it, as you recall. They felt pressured to yay or nay on that, just as they did for Medicare for All. So I do think she does have a lot of political power, and she does have a lot of influence on the party, but that definitely does not translate in a very diverse group of Democrats to have a legislative power at this juncture.
Do you think, I mean, how would you characterize her relationship with Pelosi? Like, do you think, is she, you know, I mean, there's always factions in Congress, but has she done a better job over the ensuing, you know, year and a half of understanding the culture there and building some of those bridges?
I think so. I mean, she got rid of a lot of her staff that were kind of instigating a lot with other members, which Pelosi didn't like. You know, I think Pelosi's frustration, and I'm not validating him, I'm just explaining it. I think Pelosi's frustration with AOC and some of the, and probably Ilhan Omar in particular, a little bit maybe Rashida Tlaib. I put Ayanna Pressley in her own category. She's a little separate and apart from them, even though she's officially in the squad and they do stuff together. She's a longtime city hall person, rather city council person in Boston, more pragmatic, doesn't always vote with them. I think Pelosi's frustration was she saw their political power. She knows where things were headed. She almost, didn't get to be speaker. She wasn't dum-dum, but she wanted them to use that for good within their caucus on the Hill instead of tangling with her colleagues. And I think that, and kind of in her mind, that was playing into their Republican adversaries. And so I think that was difficult for her. And she's also a seniority-minded person, so I don't think she cared about, the Green New Deal and those things. She kind of mocked it, as you recall. But again, that's just a huge generational divide. Nancy Pelosi, even those who opposed her and said they weren't going to vote for her for speaker, and some of them didn't, most of them did, have had to acknowledge that she's been this great foil for them against the president, right? No one seems to get under his skin the way she does. At the same time, make no mistake, everyone understands that she has one foot in the past in a sense anyway. And, these younger men and women, but particularly women, are really the future of the party. She understands that.
So I did find it really funny, and then I want to move on to some other members, but you have this line in there about how Republicans are obsessed with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, tweeting negatively and both begging their colleagues to introduce them to her.
Yeah, that's how
so there's some of that star power, even within Congress for some of these members.
Yeah, I mean, you see them on TV and then here they are, Right. I mean, people feel that way. I can remember the first time I walked into the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, and I almost literally rammed into Olympia Snow. It's like, oh, I've been seeing this woman on TV and here she is, I mean, there is a larger than life quality to them, and especially in those hallways. Of course, she was feeling that seeing John Lewis, right? I mean, she couldn't believe she was seeing him in the flesh. So there was a lot of that going on.
Yeah. I had a Romney moment last fall like that, where you're like, oh, he is tall.
Yes. And very cheerful.
Very cheerful. So, another member I want to talk about, she is from California and has had her own viral moments, but is a very different person than AOC, is Katie Porter. She, of course, beat Mimi Walters down in Orange County. This was one of the districts that Democrats flipped in California in 2018. She comes from a consumer background. She was a student of Elizabeth Warren's. She has really made her mark nationally by these viral videos of her grilling, the Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, going after members of Congress or of the administration, but she's in an interesting spot. I feel like she kind of sits between the more moderate members that we'll get to in a second, who really pushed impeachment over the edge, who came from national security backgrounds, those ones that won Republican districts, and the squad and the really left. I mean, it seems like she inhabits an interesting space. And I'm curious, how you think she's approached that, given that she is still in a relatively purple district, but she's coming from such a consumer progressive background.
Yeah, I've been actually surprised. Again, anybody who won a Republican district, I didn't really expect them to be particularly progressive. I would say, she's definitely an example of someone who has decided to lean that way in a formerly Republican seat, which tells me that she must feel, and she certainly does raise a lot of money, that Orange County isn't, the Orange County that we all knew and understood it to be. In fact, you mentioned impeachment. She was one of the people who came out on the early side again, former law professor. I think that she's, I've spent time with her in her district, and she connects with people pretty well there. And I think she really makes an effort. Again, I was sitting in her car one day and she was talking to constituents, and a lot of them were Republicans, and they appreciated her reaching out to them. So, she's trying to make those personal connections in the district. That's what you have to do, especially when you are in a purple or even red district and you're a Democrat, or, from the opposite party of your district. And at first I thought, geez, she's kind of a lot more progressive than most people I see coming from Republican districts. And I wondered about that, but she's stuck with it, and perhaps even gotten more so. I think that she has become sort of, as you've alluded to, a bit of a liberal icon in those viral moments that you see on the Now This videos. It's AOC, it's her. But I think you're right. Of course, she is in agreement with most of those, the vast majority of those left positions. And in fact, there's a scene in my book where she gets in a fight with Abigail Spanberger on the floor about a border bill and said, why don't you go join the Republican Party? I mean, that
surprised me. That seems, I mean, she's a plain spoken person. She's really funny too. Yes. But I was surprised that she was that confrontational with another Democrat.
I've seen Katie Porter, to me, is a very interesting character, and I always like to be really careful about how we talk about women in this way, but she can be very intense. I've seen her be really intense with staff. She's been intense with me when she's thought I've been hanging around a little bit too much. But then there's also this thing where you can tell she wants to be liked. I mean, there's a real push and pull with her, I think. I think she's, frankly speaking, pretty stressed out. She's got 3 kids. She's a single mom. Not only does she live across the country from Washington with 3-hour time difference, but she lives someplace where you can't even go airport to airport. So I think that she has a lot of just personal stress in her life. And you talked about people, you alluded to this earlier about people coming from different backgrounds. And, as a single mom, when she was running, she told people, I don't know, Congress isn't built for people like me. So, not a wealthy woman. Congress is obviously full of lots of wealthy people, and again, a single mom dealing with that. So I think that she's got a lot of competing things going on, and I'm not always sure that she loves being here, that she loves this job, but she's quite effective.
Yeah. Well, she's also, you talk about her being a mom. She also, I don't know that she wanted to talk about it, but has embraced her own experience with domestic violence with her children's father, talking about that. Ayanna Pressley has been speaking out about her experience of being raped and sexually abused as a child. It strikes me that these women, and we kind of talked about this a little at the top, but are just more willing to bring their personal experiences with them. And I don't know, I've thought about this personally. I feel like my generation, has this different opportunity that we're parents too, and we need to bring that to the table, because previous generations of women kind of had to shove their kids aside and pretend like they didn't exist. Right. So can you talk about that? And has that upset the sort of norms of Congress to be so personal, not just in their campaigning, but when they're talking on the floor of the House, they're talking about these things in a manner that's not super clinical?
So with regards to that, I'll take you back to seeing the book where Patty Murray, who won in 1992, told me that the first time she went out to the Senate floor on her first piece of legislation, it was a healthcare bill.
And that was the year of the woman, right?
Correct. And she was talking about a constituent who was choosing between, I think it was about maybe a family leave issue, between going to work and caring for her son with leukemia. And she came off the floor, and a male senator said to her, "We don't talk about personal stuff on the floor. We use graphs and pie charts and things."
It wasn't even her story.
It wasn't even her story, and she couldn't even believe it. And now everyone does that, so that's breaking the norms and ways of how we talk about politics. And everybody understands that you have to personalize politics for people. When you talk about being able to talk about your kids or your domestic violence or your history with poverty or your current financial circumstances, to me, I see that as an extension of or inherent to the kind of authenticity moment that we have in politics. And, quite frankly, some of Donald Trump's fans, that's what they say about him, right? He says it real. He keeps it real. He talks real. He says what he really thinks. I think that people appreciate that the person that they see at home is the person that they're going to see in Washington, that that the person is not trying to hide who they are, and they can judge them on those merits as well as their policy positions. And that's just kind of where we are politically in the country. I think on both sides of the aisle, people want to feel personally connected to and know the stories of and believe in and believe they're seeing the real person that they're considering voting for.
I feel like we would be remiss not mentioning one person who maybe got, well, I mean, I don't even know how to phrase that, but Katie Hill, who really came into office, I mean, won this very difficult district in northern Los Angeles County, southern Ventura County, beat the Republican incumbent Steve Knight there. And really, I think more so than other freshmen, was embraced by Pelosi. I mean, she brought her to the table on a lot of things. She seemed to be rising as a leader. And then in October was taken down by what she says is revenge porn, essentially. It's a sort of strange situation with her husband and a threesome. And but you mentioned in the book, like, the irony of her having to sort of exit stage left so quickly after this, when there are still men in Congress who have been accused of things. Of course, our president has been accused of some pretty terrible things. Why? Talk about how that played out on the Hill, and like why you think she decided not to stay and fight. And Pelosi, it seemed, really wanted her to get going.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time, especially after, Congress had just passed all this Me Too legislation, and she was sort of the first person ensnared in it. And it definitely was a time when many, I don't know, people in this country first heard the word throuple. So it was definitely an unusual situation, even in the context of sex scandals we've seen 1,000 times on the Hill. So she was a pet of Pelosi's. She had been elected by her peers as a leader for the freshman class, did have a seat at the table, and Pelosi often picks one person to be totally into, and she was definitely that person. And in the beginning showed support for her, and somewhere along the line decided that she didn't have that anymore, and they definitely seemed to be like, go away, that's all right, never mind. I think, as I've always heard it, that Katie Hill really just saw that there was going to be this drip, drip, drip of videos and attacks, and she didn't want to go through that and put herself through that. And she recounted that in a New York Times op-ed, how she, in fact, had become really suicidal at that point. Right. But I will say this, and this is not always a popular thing to say when people ask me about this, and they ask me about it a lot. I will say that, first of all, there have been some men certainly run out of Congress. I mean, and Mitch McConnell, believe it or not, went after Bob Packwood big time. John Boehner used to run people out. So it isn't completely bifurcated that way. But with regards to Katie Hill, taking out the specifics of the complaint and how it goes vis-a-vis men, I think probably what happened for Pelosi and others is that it called into question something that people want from you, even when you've been authentically cool as young millennial, your videos are you rock climbing, you have goats in your yard. But when you get to Congress, they want you to have good judgment. And they want to feel that, at the long end of the day, when these incredibly momentous decisions are being made, by you as a body, that you're a person who has judgment. And I think that what happened in that situation is that there may be a sense that was lacking in some of her decisions. And so I tend to think of it more as that than sometimes the specifics of what would actually happened.
Right. In the context, I think of the fact that impeachment hearings were underway. And I mean, there's a lot that's being juggled outside of just one individual person in those types of cases. Cool. Well, we're going to go to some audience questions soon, but I do, and I might come back to some of this, but I want to look forward and ask you broadly how things look for this class, understanding they have very, very varied districts. And in particular, these moderates that we've alluded to, the Spanbergers and Congresswoman Mikey.
Cheryl.
Cheryl, yeah.
Cheryl from New Jersey, right?
Yeah. And so they, if folks don't remember, are the ones that authored that op-ed that really, I would say, tipped the scale towards impeachment, saying after the Ukraine things came to light that they felt like it was necessary. And it was a surprise because they had all been very cautious about that issue. do you feel like most of them are in a good position to defend their seats? I mean, how is 2020 shaping up? Do we have any sense, because the world is insane and time is a flat circle? And who knows where we'll be by November?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I would say that. But we always talk about the top of the ticket in presidential years, but this year it's everything. This is a referendum on Donald Trump. The last 4 years, the last 4 months. And, we don't have a big recent history of this country of ticket splitting. It does happen, obviously, but I think that in most districts, which way goes Donald Trump? There'll be some Trump districts that some of these Democrats who've made inroads will hold on to. Some will lose their seats. Probably Democrats will pick up some seats in a few places too. I know they're looking very greedily at Texas, for example, but I think most of it's just going to be driven by the top of the ticket.
Yeah. And how, well, I can go to one of the audience questions on this. Jennifer Gee asked, what role are those more moderate Democrats playing? Like, how have they sort of made their mark, and are they continuing to in Congress?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of keep their head down and do their legislation on healthcare and national security and do their committee issues. When it comes to their own reelection, they tend to be very issues focused, whether it's drug prices, and now it's completely COVID response, especially in the very hard hit districts. And they try really hard not to yoke themselves too much to the conversation about Trump. It's a little different now, I would think, but a lot of times that just wasn't a winning message for them. So they're very focused on, again, laws and committee hearings within their areas of jurisdiction and expertise. And I have to say one thing about this class is they are have these incredible professional backgrounds, very diverse, and they know their stuff. And so it really shows.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're doing a lot more reporting in that vein, given what we saw this week with the protest and the sort of question over the military involvement in quelling protests. I mean, is that something you're hearing any of these folks speak up about because of their national security experience?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, you have a lot of women here who are veterans, military veterans, and people who worked in the national security space and the CIA and the DOD and so forth. So I think you're going to be hearing a lot about that.
All right. We have a question from Julie Miller asking, how do we address intersectionality without seeming to discuss issues such as racism, anti-Semitism in competition with women's issues? I think she's asking, is it an either or for women in Congress? I mean, that makes me think of, really a lot of that class. I know on the question of anti-Semitism, Ilhan Omar has gotten a lot of blowback, but I think from her perspective, she's also been standing up for folks that haven't been represented in Congress historically.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, again, with the diversity issue, I think that's the kind of stuff that these women have been more focused on. What's interesting to me about the feminism question, first of all, when you frame it around Donald Trump, right, they're talking about him, some of the stuff you alluded to earlier, there's so many things for them to address, but some of it does obviously have to do with his alleged treatment of women. But I think what's interesting about these women that's a little different than sometimes has happened historically is they truly, really do lift each other up. The squad does that for each other. These national security women, they knew each other during the campaign. They campaigned together, and they do a lot of work together. And they just, even within the context of other veterans and freshman veterans, they are a tight group overall. Even these women have this subset, this their own text group. They are just, I think that they express their feminism through really supporting each other and being very pro other women in a very authentic way.
Yeah. Jack DeWeese writes, young people are often accused of not voting. I'll say it's not an accusation. I think it's reality. Right. But he wants to know if you think this new cohort will help change that. It will encourage more people to participate.
I think more people are participating in the political process. I think more people are participating politically. We see them on the streets all over our country. For some reason, that has not been translating into voting as much. It's interesting because that has been a message, whether it's been a message of Barack Obama, it's been a message I've seen even in Atlanta, like people from the rap community talking about voting for, you saw talking about voting for DAs even. So I think that people are trying to encourage that from all levels. And this will be the test of whether that actually trickles down, because in a lot of ways there's some pushback to that too. Hey, I can't vote out the cop who killed my brother who's been serially abusive to people. We can't vote out police. So to be politically active means to have street action. So sometimes people do almost make a choice and look at it in this bifurcated way instead of really looking at this as sort of dual actions. So we'll see in 2020. We'll see. It's historically been really tough to get young people to vote.
Yeah. Well, and in that regard too, it's like we spend so much time talking about Trump and Congress, but the truth is, like, who controls police departments? It's mayors and police chiefs. I mean, there's a lot of layers to that.
District attorneys, in some places judges are elected.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it would be fascinating to see if how much down ticket sort of campaigning some of these high profile folks do in those cases.
Well, look, you have Mara Ferguson now, just the other night,
right.
African-American woman. So, voting does make a difference in these situations. It truly does.
And you guys, I think in DC had a pretty progressive slate of city council folks, right?
Yes. I confess with embarrassment, I don't pay as much attention to DC local politics beyond the mayor, because she's always fighting with the federal government. But you are correct.
I saw it on Twitter. It must be true.
Okay.
Lynn Cameron asks, do you think that the rise of these women, specifically AOC, is a direct response to 2016, or was it part of a growing trend before Trump?
Of women running for office? I mean, certainly.
Or their success, I think, in running for office, and I think Lynn means specifically in terms of the more progressive women.
I mean, women came out to run, and it's interesting, by the way. Republican women looked at that and said, "Well, we don't agree with any of their policy positions, but they're showing us that women can win." And Republican women are starting to win some primaries in this cycle. It's really interesting. I meant to catch up on that today. They are doing better. I think you'll see more of them. But look, from the minute of the Women's March, which is where a lot of people decided to run, or shortly thereafter, there's no question that the presidency of Donald Trump, and it wasn't just around the perception of him as being terrible for women. A lot of these women who ran, it was because they have their deep concerns about our national security and intelligence apparatus. There were a lot of different issues around Donald Trump that inspired women to run. Healthcare, a lot of people were running more against Republicans in Congress in their failed attempts to unravel the Affordable Care Act. So, but there's no question that he was an inspiration for a lot of people.
So, I think Biden has promised to pick a woman as a VP, although sometimes it feels like that's people around him said it, but we are expecting that Joe Biden will pick a woman. I know reporters love making guesses at this, but I do want to know if you think anyone we've been talking about, I guess there's Kamala Harris seems to be at the top of the list. She was part of the 2016 class. But yeah, do you see that there is a path for anybody in the House or the Senate to that potential pick? And I don't know, how does that strike you as monumental in itself, that you have that promise sort of being given before officially he has the nomination, Raven?
I think that's definitely complicated. Harris at this moment just feels like this natural pick, but I do remember so much when she was running that there were all kinds of progressives who called her the cop and were very upset with her professional history. I'll
say sitting here, it's funny to me because I don't see her as the most natural pick, but I also think that the closer you are to people, sometimes the more challenging it can be,
Well, she's been a pretty outspoken voice in these last few weeks in ways that I think have really appealed to folks. But I think that it's funny because once you commit to a woman, you're raising and lowering expectations at the same time, right? It's like, I'm not going to say I'm just going to pick the best person and there's a woman. It's like, I'm going to pick a woman, and therefore it may or may not be the most qualified person. You're sort of almost framing women as this other group that may or may not actually be the best pick, if I'm making any sense. So it sort of, in a way, sort of denigrates the sentiment in some level, instead of just saying I'm going to pick the person who I think can most unite our country, and then of course having deciding that was a woman. Having said that, there were a lot of people who were excited about that. I think he's pretty much held to that now, and that's kind of hard to imagine that coming from the House. It does feel like the Senate of the States is where that pick would be most sensible for him.
Yeah. It is an interesting one, and it feels like it's just now fueling everybody's guessing game to a point.
And always. And I think he said he's not going to even do it till August, right, or something.
Right,
So.
and it's historically, it doesn't seem like it's been the tipping point for most candidates, right? I mean, this is not. It's important, but it's not necessarily going to win or lose you the election.
Yeah, although I'll remind everybody that the true progenitor to Trump that we forget about a lot, Sarah Palin, did spark up his ticket for a while, so it can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think given Joe Biden's age, there are a lot of questions about what this means. It's not just a VP pick; it's sort of an anointing a next leader of the party. Right. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. I do have another audience question asking, how can we as citizens combat harassment and ad hominem disinformation campaigns targeted at women in Congress, she notes the squad, to ensure the safety of these and future female elected officials? I don't know if you can answer that, Jennifer, but I do think it's an interesting topic because there's a lot in this book about some of that harassment, whether it be after they visited a border facility, being actually confronted by protesters as they tried to have a press conference. Obviously, we know that Twitter can be quite a sewer for anybody, especially women. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say, talk to Mark Zuckerberg about that. I mean, I know it's a cliche at this point, but it's absolutely impossible to overstate the role that these platforms have had, particularly you mentioned disinformation. That is, the government has had an uneasy relationship with these platforms, and that's understandable. And there are all kinds of different views on that in the left and the right. But without some sort of commitment from the Twitters and the Facebook executives of the world, this is going to be the harassment, disinformation, the infiltration of foreign governments in our elections is going to, I have to say, be really hard to curb.
All right. We have about a minute left, and we have your hardest question yet, which is we always like to ask everybody, what is your 60-second idea to change the world?
Oh, gosh, my 60-second idea. This is a weird answer, and you probably won't even find it that interesting. But I think that what I would say to my kids a lot is try to change careers a lot. I think people need to change what they're doing in their lives and change the spaces that they're in, and maybe even the physical places that they are, and to try and get a broad perspective, to try and have associations, friendships, even if not friendships, interactions with people you don't agree with, people from all parts of the spectrum. We all kind of live in our own geographic bubbles at this point. And to try to take yourself out of that and to kind of know as many, interact with as many different types of people to really understand where people are coming from. I talked to a voter today in the military who voted for Trump in 2016 because she wasn't interested in politics, and she only decided to engage when she saw that some of her colleagues were upset about it, and to start to really try to learn, understand. She didn't know anything about it because she didn't pay attention. So people malign people for motivations and intentions which may just stem from the fact that they're actually not, they're living their lives and they're not as engaged as you are. So I think more interaction, not less, with our fellow Americans actually was my idea.
That is probably a very apt thing to say in this moment as we talk about our very complicated history and our need to kind of bridge it.
Yes.
Jennifer Steinhauer, thank you so much for joining us for Inform today at the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you. It was such an honor to be with you. I appreciate it.
We'd like to remind our audience that copies of Jennifer's book, The First, The Inside Story of the Women Reshaping Congress, are available for purchase. And if you'd like to watch more virtual programs or programming, please give commonwealthclub.org/give. Please visit. You can give there. Visit there to give. I am Marisa Lagos from KQED. Thank you, and stay safe.